London, 1822. The air is thick with the soot of the Industrial Revolution and the fever of newfound wealth. In the coffee houses of Exchange Alley, men in silk hats whisper of a land that sounds like a fever dream. A land of eternal spring, where the rivers run over beds of pure gold, where the soil is so fertile it yields 3 harvests of corn a year, and where the air is untainted by the grime of the modern world. They call it Poyais. It is a sovereign nation on the Mosquito Coast of Central America, a paradise waiting for the bold to claim it. At the center of this frenzy stands a man who looks every bit the hero the British public craves, Sir Gregor MacGregor, a general, a knight of the Order of Christ, and now the self-proclaimed cacique of Poyais. He does not just offer an investment, he offers a new life, but beneath the glittering descriptions and the official seals of the Poyaisian government lies a mechanism of deception so sophisticated that it will not just break banks, it will cost hundreds of lives. The timing was perfect. Britain was emerging from the Napoleonic Wars as the undisputed master of the seas. But its investors were restless. The interest rates on government bonds had plummeted, leaving the wealthy and the middle class alike desperate for higher returns. The newly independent republics of South America seemed like the final frontier, a place where a man could turn a modest inheritance into a fortune overnight. MacGregor knew this hunger. He played upon it with the precision of a master conductor. He didn't just tell stories, he built a reality. He published a 350-page guidebook filled with intricate maps and detailed descriptions of the capital city, St. Joseph. He spoke of its grand boulevards, its domed cathedral, its bustling port, and its sophisticated parliamentary system. To the bankers of the City of London, he offered something even more tangible. He issued a loan of £200,000, backed by the perceived limitless resources of his territory. In the eyes of the public, MacGregor was a visionary. He moved through the highest circles of society with an aura of unshakable confidence. He opened a Poyaisian legation in the heart of London, an office that hummed with the administrative energy of a rising empire. Here, the deception became physical. Investors didn't just buy shares, they exchanged their hard-earned British pounds for Poyaisian dollars, beautifully engraved banknotes printed by official banknote engravers. It was a masterpiece of financial theater. By the time the first ships, the Honduras Packet and the Kennersley Castle, began to congregate at the docks, the frenzy had reached a breaking point. These were not just speculators. They were cobblers, bakers, retired officers, and young families. They had sold their homes, their shops, and their tools, pouring every penny into the promise of the Mosquito Coast. As the sails unfurled and the ships began their long journey across the Atlantic, the mood was one of triumph. MacGregor stood on the docks, a figure of grand authority, waving goodbye to the pioneers of his new Eden. He had given them everything they thought they needed. Land grants, signed in his own hand, official appointments to government posts, and a currency that was supposed to be the envy of the Americas. They believed they were sailing toward a future of prestige and plenty. But as the English coastline faded into the gray mist, a terrifying reality remained hidden in the hold of the ships. MacGregor had spent months documenting the flora, the fauna, and the geography of Poyais. He had described the sophisticated laws and the peaceful indigenous tribes. He had even composed a national anthem. There was only one thing he had neglected to mention. The country of Poyais, with its grand cathedrals, its golden rivers, and its bustling capital of St. Joseph, did not exist. The Atlantic is a vast, unforgiving expanse. And for the 250 souls aboard the Honduras Packet and the Kennersley Castle, it was the bridge to a new empire. They spent their days on deck, clutching their Poyaisian land grants, dreaming of the estates they would build in the valley of the Black River. They studied the maps MacGregor had provided, memorizing the layout of the capital city, planning the businesses they would open and the lives they would lead. They were the elite of a new world, or so they believed. But as the tropical heat began to thicken and the coast of Central America finally appeared on the horizon, the first cracks in the illusion began to surface. There were no pilot boats to greet them. There were no lighthouse beacons cutting through the night. There was only the sound of the surf breaking against a jagged, desolate shore. When the first boats touched the sand, the silence was deafening. The grand port of St. Joseph, with its stone quays and bustling commerce, was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a wall of impenetrable jungle and a strip of sun-scorched beach. The settlers stood in the surf, looking at their maps, then at the wilderness, then back at their maps. They wandered into the brush, searching for the grand boulevards, the domed cathedral, the government buildings where they were supposed to take up their official posts. They found nothing but the ruins of an abandoned wooden hut, rotting in the humidity. The realization did not come all at once. It was a slow, creeping horror. They told themselves they had simply landed in the wrong place, that the capital was just around the next headland, that the general would never have sent them to a wasteland. But the general was thousands of miles away, and the reality of the Mosquito Coast was beginning to take hold. This was not a land of eternal spring. It was a swamp, the heat was a physical weight, and the insects carried a silent, microscopic death. Within days, the supplies began to fail. The settlers had brought everything they thought they needed for a civilized life, including thousands of Poyasian dollars, the beautifully engraved notes they had purchased in London. But here, in the mud of the Black River, those notes were nothing more than scraps of paper. There were no shops to spend them in, no banks to exchange them, no government to honor them. The very symbols of their wealth had become a cruel mockery. Back in London, the mechanism of the fraud was still spinning. MacGregor was not hiding. He was celebrating. He was attending galas, negotiating further loans, and preparing even more ships to follow the first wave of settlers. He was a master of the secondary market, watching as the value of Poyasian bonds fluctuated on the London Stock Exchange. He understood a fundamental truth of high finance. That perception is more powerful than reality, as long as no one looks too closely. He had created a circular economy of lies, using the money from new investors to pay the interest on the initial loans, a proto-Ponzi scheme wrapped in the flag of a fictional nation. But on the shores of the Black River, the fantasy was dying. The rainy season arrived with a violence they had never imagined. The settlers, many of whom were city dwellers with no knowledge of survival, were trapped between the sea and the jungle. Fever began to spread through the camp, a burning, delirious sickness that turned neighbors against each other. The social hierarchy MacGregor had carefully constructed began to dissolve. The colonels, the bankers, and the officials he had appointed found themselves begging for scraps of salted pork. They were dying for a country that existed only in the mind of a madman. And as the death toll began to rise, a lone ship appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a rescue vessel. It was another ship full of settlers, more victims arriving to join the nightmare. The scale of the catastrophe was about to explode, and the British government was finally starting to ask questions. The arrival of the third ship, the Mexican Eagle, was not a rescue. It was a death sentence. As the new arrivals stepped onto the sand expecting a flourishing colony, they were met by hollow-eyed ghosts. Men who had been captains of industry in London were now crawling through the mud, their skin yellowed by fever, their fine clothes reduced to rags. There was no St. Joseph. There was no cathedral. There was only a graveyard under the palms. The realization was a physical blow. The settlers began to die at an agonizing rate, 7, 8, sometimes 10 a day. The humidity rotted their boots, and the tropical rains turned their makeshift shelters into tombs. Yet, even as they buried their children in the sand, some refused to believe the truth. They clutched their Poyasian banknotes, convinced that a clerical error had sent them to the wrong coordinate, that the general would surely come to save them. But Sir Gregor MacGregor was not coming. In the gilded halls of London, he was busy perfecting the next stage of the extraction. He had successfully raised £200,000, an astronomical sum in 1823, and he was already negotiating a second loan for $500,000 more. The financial mechanism was breathtakingly simple. He used the prestige of his military career to bypass the skepticism of the banks. He didn't just sell land, he sold sovereignty. He had created a central bank, a coat of arms, and a complex hierarchy of civil service positions that he sold to the highest bidder. To the British investor, Poyais wasn't a gamble. It was a certainty backed by the supposed infrastructure of a modern state. MacGregor had turned a geographical void into a blue-chip asset through the sheer power of branding. The exposure began not with a confession, but with a chance encounter. A British merchant ship, the Mexican Eagle, finally realized the magnitude of the disaster and evacuated the few survivors who could still walk. They were taken to British Honduras, now Belize, where the colonial authorities were horrified by what they saw. These were not pioneers, they were victims of a state-sponsored execution. Official dispatches began the slow journey back across the Atlantic, reports of a wasteland where a kingdom should have been. The news moved slower than the fraud. While the survivors were shivering in the hospitals of Belize, MacGregor was still hosting lavish dinners in London, toasted as the man who had opened the gates to the New World. The tension in London began to mount as rumors filtered through the shipping lanes. Investors who had poured their life savings into Poyasian bonds started to gather outside the Poyasian legation. The doors were locked, the clerks were gone. The elegant stationery and the engraved maps remained, but the man at the center of the web had vanished. MacGregor, sensing the wind shifting, did not flee to the jungle. He did something far bolder. He crossed the English Channel and arrived in Paris. He didn't hide. He didn't change his name. He simply started the process all over again. He began printing new brochures, in French this time, describing a land of eternal spring, a land called Poyais. He was banking on the fact that greed is a universal language. and that the distance between a lie and the truth is exactly as long as it takes for a ship to cross the ocean. But the French authorities were not as easily charmed as the British public, and the clock was finally ticking down on the greatest fiction in financial history. The trap in Paris snapped shut before the first French ship could leave the harbor. The French authorities, far more suspicious of sudden, unearned wealth than their British counterparts, noticed a strange influx of settlers and capital linked to a country they could not find on any map. They arrested MacGregor, throwing the self-proclaimed prince into a cell, but the man was a phantom. Through a masterclass in legal maneuvering and a calculated defense that placed the blame on his subordinates, he walked free. He returned to London, the very scene of his greatest crime, and incredibly, he tried to sell the dream of Poyais one last time. He knew that the human heart is wired to hope even when the intellect screams of danger. He knew that there is always a new generation of investors who believe they are smarter than the last. But the world had moved on, and the ghosts of the Black River could no longer be silenced. Of the hundreds of settlers who had sailed for the Mosquito Coast, fewer than 50 returned to Britain. They were broken men and women, their health destroyed, their savings vanished, their families buried in the mud. The scandal sent shockwaves through the London Stock Exchange, contributing to the massive financial crash of 1825. Banks collapsed, fortunes disappeared overnight, and the British government was forced to reckon with the reality of unregulated sovereign debt. MacGregor had not just stolen money, he had exposed a fundamental flaw in the global financial system. He had proven that money is not backed by gold or land, but by a story. And if the storyteller is convincing enough, the world will pay any price to listen. MacGregor eventually fled to Venezuela, where he was welcomed as a hero of the Wars of Independence. He died in Caracas in 1845, receiving a full military funeral with honors. He was never brought to justice for the lives he ended or the families he ruined. He lived out his days on a general's pension, a man who had invented a kingdom out of thin air and made the world believe it was real. The Poyaisian bonds, once worth thousands of pounds, became worthless scraps of paper, kept only as grim souvenirs of a time when greed blinded an entire nation. Today, the Mosquito Coast remains a dense, sparsely populated wilderness. There are no grand cathedrals, no domed government buildings, no bustling ports. The jungle has reclaimed everything. But the legacy of the Poyais Fraud lives on in every speculative bubble, every fraudulent cryptocurrency, and every once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity that promises the world for a small entry fee. We live in an age of digital Poyais, where the maps are more beautiful and the influencers are more polished. But the mechanism remains the same. We are still the settlers on the beach, staring at our screens, waiting for a city that was never built, clutching a currency that was never minted. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.